Behind the walls of a magnificent farm in Virginia, what secret did a slave woman conceal? How far may sorrow go before turning into retaliation? And what was the truth that no visitor could ever conceive being presented at a New Year's feast? A tale that was recounted only in tradition, buried in quiet, and sealed in fear. Are you prepared to listen to it? A silence that was not calm, but rather the habit of terror pervaded the Whitmore plantation throughout the winter of 1807. The frost knitted the fields into a fragile fabric, and the air tasted of ash from the previous season's cane and iron from the forges. As one learns a prayer, Esther learnt the rhythm of that silence, how work started before the sun, how it finished when it sank, and how fatigue drained the body to the point where even dreams could be put away like tools and removed only when no one was looking. She was young, but in this place, youth was a worthless commodity. The first person to say her name was a mother, whose face she could only recall by touch. It was alive now, priced in a stranger's ink, written in a stranger's. Hand on the ledger. Every night, she measured the distances between footsteps, the distances between the kitchen and the rear stair, the distance between the kitchen and the quarters, and the distance between the stair and the door that opened without knocking. The pain of the rite was that it was unspectacular and mechanical. Violence had regular shoes. It came with the sour sweetness of cologne and clean cuffs. The house has a method of teaching and ingesting sound, quiet to even the walls and hinges. Esther also learned how to appear absent while standing inside. Her own body, a gradual, covert departure marked out only by breath. During the day, she worked in the kitchen, which was a tiny kingdom where time was measured by simmering, baking, and boiling. Copper pots gleamed like awards for some triumph. That didn't belong to her. Like pale weather, the flour floated. As devoted as soldiers, knives that had been polished to a silent brilliance laid and rose. She recognized the hours a stew needed to lose its hardness, the submission of dough and the mastery of heat. In her mind, this information created a private realm surrounded by sense and task repetition. In that nation, a wooden spoon had the power to change the entire globe. The others recognized the set of her shoulders. A crust was placed in her hand, a hymn was whispered as the wind rose, a spot was prepared for her by the hearth, where flames sparkled like waiting stars, and their glances were little sacrifices. What could not be named was not named. An elderly, woman related tales of rivers that could recall each crossing, and of names that were hidden from ledgers. She was given a lopsided charm made of straw by a youngster who was not yet tall enough for the plow. He claimed that if you looked at it without blinking, it could prevent unpleasant dreams. It was in Esther's apron. She didn't try its magic. Like a confessional, the back stair took her in night after night. She was aware of the precise number of boards that lodged complaints, point at which the kitchen's warmth was lost, and the air became thin and beeswax lacquered. She was aware that a candle may appear benevolent until its shadow learnt to speak her shape, and that the moon could loom enormous over the naked pecan tree and never reach this interior. She was aware that the present tense was necessary for work, that hands would find the wash basin, that cornmeal would rise and fall beneath her fingertips, and that dawn would arrive nevertheless. Without any drama, the first snowfall fell, a sifting of white that covered the earth's scars without mending them. Once the hearth was banked, Esther stood in the doorway and listened to the faint breathing in the field. There were spaces beyond, the large house and the road that were unclaimed, places where her name would resonate as itself rather than as property. As one leans into a breeze that opposes and steadies, she leaned toward that thinking. A tiny ember caught hold somewhere in that leaning, something that didn't seem like wrath or hope, but rather the colder, more distinct element that both might be pulled from. It hasn't spoken yet. It just waited, patiently and precisely counting the seconds the way frost counts fences. Not even the untying of the frost and allowing it to fold itself back into the soil marked the arrival of spring. With the aching in her lower back and the sour turn of morning bread, Esther secretly carried the thaw, with the cautious grace of someone who understands that a single slip-up can call a name that is not hers to answer. She worked smaller at first, then slower. Without asking, the kitchen gauged her by the weight of the buckets, the reach for the upper shelf, and the manner. The distant laughing coming from the rooms where decisions were spilled like wine made her tense. She covered the bulge with layers of fabric. When the elderly women noticed, they saw how thunder is felt before it is heard. The wind was flat, the water was boiling, the hearth was warming the fabric, and the hands were more trained than any book-guided breath between worlds. On the night he arrived, Esther remained silent. She had no intention of keeping. Her life was answered. The house, which is so good at swallowing, did not swallow that one, and it let out a thin, shocked cry. His hair was as taut as young vines. His complexion was the color of fresh walnut, and his fingers moved as though they were testing the air's seams. Pressing him to her chest, she discovered the precise weight of her future. True, not light or heavy. She gave him the name Elias. She chose the name for a persistent whisper that won't be swapped, not for fire or thunder. The elderly woman nodded as though a door had been softly closed to keep out a draft. After sewing the straw charm into his blanket's lining, Esther watched him sleep intently, learning the little grammar of his breath, milk, lullaby, warm cloth, and hushed prayer. She was able to hold the rope that the hours had braided into. His hunger controlled the course of the days. The shaded spot behind the flower box, the curve where the stair meets the wall, the gentle hush of dawn when there are few footsteps. She studied hiding places the way others map rivers. She gave him a game to play where silence was triumph. He, who had no knowledge of the world's arithmetic, recognized its first rule when she put a finger to her lips in response to a floorboard sighing or a voice sharpening in the adjacent room. Calculation wore perfume in the large mansion. The mistress called him the small one, which signified inventory and carried no weight. The master's gaze lingered on the line of his mouth for an excessive amount of time before continuing with the neat impatience of someone who has just finished reading a page, ownership and denial. At that table, they each had a chair. Esther leaned between them, a bridge that no one was allowed to cross, feeling the cold of both. Rumor had it that a new law will be passed across the river in the winter, closing a door that had been left open for too long. The rumor was accepted by the quarters in the same manner as the weather, impersonal, unavoidable, and not a rescue. The 1st of January, when names could be hired out like tools and bodies were listed, compared, and selected, was closer than the law. In murmurs that never made it to the parlor, they dubbed it Heartbreak Day. Instead, Esther pressed her jaw to the teeth of the calendar and started to measure the passing of time by his milestones. The initial clasp, the initial grin, and the delightful surprise of his eyes meeting hers, as though they had always known how. She verbally promised him a future at night when the house was asleep and the fields were dreaming of their own green. This was not because promises bind fate, but rather because they bind the one who talks. She pledged to keep him. Uncounted as long as breath permits being both storm and harbor when necessary. A other life awaited somewhere beyond the boundaries of the groomed garden. Waiting, however, was a luxury. All she had was a tiny body against her, a trickle of milk, and the unmistakable unsentimental. Understanding that love in this place would necessitate a strict memory and secrecy. She fed the ember through the winter, and it grew brighter. Not yet, just a steady coal, no blaze. Having the patience to endure the morning, the year dwindled to its edge with a noise akin to turning paper. To ward off the January bite, they repaired a boot, patched a latch, and bound a quilt to record the days in the quarters. Speaking of beginnings with voices that could not recall how they ended, they practiced toasts and polished silver in the large home. Because springs are designed to appear innocuous, Esther examined the hinge between seasons in the same way, that one studies a trap, not just out of dread. With the courage of a sailor, Elias nearly walked into the world, his palms out for balance and his laughter stitched to his breath, like it might stitch him to safety. The edges fray, but she kept him to the safe ones. One afternoon, like sugared smoke, a song from the parlor poured through the rear door. Elias trailed behind it, past the map of the kitchen, past the pump where buckets banged against their iron elbows, past the clipped hedge between work and show. There were crushed shell walks, obedient boxwood, sculptures with blank patience, and the garden was laid out like a sentence that allowed no variation. He grabbed a bright when ribbon caught on a thorn. He was surrounded by the forbidden scents of rose and lavender. First with curiosity, then with the swift calculation that, like hunger, children in layered finery stared. As though permission might be granted by the sound, one pointed and the other laughed. Upstairs, where decisions solidified, the mistress's voice raised, flattened, and carried his presence. The master emerged, his sleeves rolled, for discussion rather than work. He didn't yell. The silence he wore proved more frightening than any storm, and he glanced at the boy before turning to face Esther, who was coming breathless. The language of ownership never falters. With the assurance of a man retrieving a misplaced tool, he spoke it by reaching, lifting, and turning away. Time unwound without knots after that. The smokehouse, where walls recalled each winter's curing, the cellar steps that stored barrel-sized barrels, the buttery with its crisp, chilly breath, the seams of the house, and the little, mournful moans of frost and wood. She didn't ask out loud. Attention is a sort of leash, and questions attract it. The kitchen started preparing for the new year with the appropriate fervor. Cloves are numbered, brine is measured, and salt is applied till it stings. Until their blades were a whisper that could cut you, knives collided with the damp stone. Since all cogs in the engine of celebration must agree, work proceeded as though nothing had changed. There was a frost at night that made like slender glass. The fields crackle. A fox barked once and then changed its mind somewhere. The elderly woman prayed in the quarters, her head lowered enough to conceal her trembling lips. On her knees, Esther sat with her hands spread wide, their palms smelling of smoke, pepper, and milk she was no longer able to provide. There was silence all around her. However, it wasn't the quiet she had become accustomed to. Like the silence before, the earth decides to release a spring. It was denser and more mineral. Her son was named in that quiet not as a request, but as a remembrance, putting every letter beneath the mouth, the breath, and the bone, out of reach of any ledger. A door in the home closed with deliberate finality, and the ember she had been watching over began to emit a more consistent heat, the kind that burns without the need for light. Brittle as spun sugar, the final day of the year rose bright and thin. As though repetition could compel the future to comply, the home practiced celebration. Lists were chanted like catechisms in the kitchen: poultry, ham, pies, preserves, and the centerpiece roast that the master promised his guests as a surprise. The overseer delivered a package laden with authority and ice before lunchtime. He spoke softly, like men do when they have decided to use a different term to convey the truth. Without calling attention to herself, the cook crossed herself. Esther raised the weight, felt its wrongness move into her arms, and signed for the delivery with her silence. She unwound a piece of paper that had creased too easily when she was by herself. The cloth that contained, where cold should have prevailed, warmth prevailed. What the eyes had yet to dare, the first breath told her. Before the details, shape made its announcement. Then came the detail, final and patient, Close to the shoulder, a crescent scar. She had picked up a little geography by touch in the dark. The globe tilted but did not fall. A clock in one of the large rooms proved the time. Arrogant and impartial, she closed the cloth once more as one shuts a book they have already committed to memory. With the apathy of iron, the kitchen waited. Work started because it prevents grief from blowing up. As usual, fire welcomed her. Carefully, she crushed herbs and salted them till their oils rose like hard facts. The language the house revered was transformed from bare certainty by heat. The sweetness that would later be lauded without comprehension permeated the air. She retained the favorite cuts are distinguished by their lack of hesitation, which comes more from instinct than strategy. Low and steady as a held breath, a broth simmered. Nobody asked. Questions are first devoured by the machinery of occasion. The afternoon stretched into the night. The laughter in the parlor eased. Its neat joy was strewn on the polished piano. With no response, Crystal chimed in a chord. Esther must have plated what plated, counted place settings, and once looked into the drab back of a spoon and saw her reflection, an phantom whose eyes were calmer than hers. No one would say it aloud, but she carried the dish that marked the end of one story and the start of another as she entered the corridor as the bell sounded. Already flushed with alcohol, he was practicing victory in front of a rehearsed audience. He wanted plenty to prove itself. Esther came, as she always did, steadily, unimpressively, the servant of hunger. She placed the tray down for admiration. Like steam, compliments arose. Someone inquired about the glaze's secret. The mistress grinned as though she could tie a ribbon with credit. With an elegance that had never known rejection, the maestro sliced the first slice and placed it on his own plate. He reached for more, nodded, and chewed. He extolled the gentleness, the seasoning miracle, and the way that wealth evaporated without disagreement. He ate without knowing. With a steady hand, Esther poured the wine and saw the red climb the bowl with confidence and depth. Toasts woven themselves into a web of claims, wealth, and ancestry around them, a future that would be similar to the past in every manner that suited them. Being as courteous as always and as patient as winter, she waited until his plate was bare before making another offer. The room fluttered with tiny gratifications as he accepted. Where his knife directed, she made the selected cut and took a step back into her designated circle. The awful circle closed without thunder, and she kept the story intact in that calculated distance. Her memory, which had been a rough edge, began to take shape. That night, remorse did not teach him its name, whether it had a flavor. However, certain truths are not communicated verbally. They move from soil to seed, from year to year, and from bone to bone. Esther went back to the kitchen where the fire was, as the dessert bell rang, had burned to a controlled radiance, and the air finally let itself chill. As the year came to an end, its ash fell away. The house awoke in the mornings with a subtle sweetness that clung to the rafters. Scent that the cold could not completely eradicate. Obedience had altered its flavor, yet Esther still walked through the rooms with the same measured obedience. The road she could walk without being recognized by those who constructed it was work, so she went back to work. She maintained the hearth's accuracy. The shops were counted. The blades began to glimmer patiently. She recalled everything and spoke little. Tiny mistakes started to bloom like flowers in the frost. Once as dry as scripture, a barrel of flour developed a subtle dampness that shaped it from the inside out. Too close to the illness, the cured meat returned to the kitchen with a bitterness that no glaze could mask. With a shrug that seemed to be a coincidence, seed corn that had been counted and applauded failed in the field. The master cursed the weather, providence, and the hesitant actions of men he paid to confirm. Esther refrained from using profanity. She measured the ashes, tended to the leavening, and salted just the worthy. The animals picked up a new apprehension. Horses that had never questioned bits refused them. The best mare refused to take the saddle and rolled her eyes at the darkness. A sickness struck the hogs, spreading from pen to pen like a persistent story. As if numbers could breathe again, the overseer stood at the gate and calculated losses. He drank in the tack room at night while snoring and swearing. A lantern tipped somewhere between the third and fourth bottle. The haloft had revealed its red secret to the sky by daybreak. Because accident is a kindness that people give to themselves, they named it an accident. The amount of credit decreased. The ledger started talking in the unintelligible, sparse tongue of made possible. Debts learned to be polite and showed up at the door with a group of strangers who grinned coldly. As if quiet could save polished wood from fading music, the mistress closed the parlor piano and dismissed 2 maids. Because the tongue recalls what the intellect rejects, the master ate less, not out of regret. At hours that are not appropriate. For the courageous, he woke up perspiring. As if listening for a step he wanted and feared, he put his ear to the dark. Stories arranged themselves into shelter in the quarters. They claimed that a fresh oath had been sworn by the land. They claimed that soil might be taught to reject a lineage by a mother's naming. When a child sang a wordless tune, the elderly grandmother closed her eyes and took it as medication. What was given to her by others was not claimed by Esther. As a scholar working on a text, she worked in the kitchen, identifying the footnotes. The author thought no one would notice. Elias was folded into speech by her. His name appeared in the breath she held while the dining room door was open, in the silences between measurements, and in the momentary pause before a pot boils. Green arrived grudgingly, as thin as penance, when spring should have fattened the fields. Branches were pulled down like broken prayers by a late storm. The master recognized the arithmetic of decline as he surveyed his acres. The number of visitors decreased. His hand was touched with such sympathy by those who arrived that he was unable to envisage an auction block. By his reckoning, night had fallen earlier. Now, as though a smell may prevent him from entering, he stayed out of the kitchen. When a woman chooses to maintain boundaries, he was unaware that they had changed. Esther maintained the embers. Stability. She discovered that vengeance is a climate rather than a fire. It is the cautious management of minor components, how to whisper to a seed so that it recalls the hand that placed it, what ferments and what preserves, which tastes better of iron and which of stone. Instead of yelling, hitting, or pleading, she made plans and waited. She held a silence that allowed a boy's name to stand up within it. The night held a listening that felt like a response when the house finally creaked like a hull taking on water, when creditors circled and rooms were locked to save candles, and when the master strolled the porch with a hunger he could not feed. The fields had even calm breathing. It cooled in the kitchen. Where there had been fire, memory kept watch.